Nobody wanted us.
Welcome to Canada.
Canada chose us.
Nguyet Ngo remembers trying to become less Vietnamese.
Like less Vietnamese.
At the time, it seemed logical. New country, new language, new culture. Fit in, move forward, become Canadian. But years later, she realized something surprising.
Curious about your culture.
That realization sounds simple. It wasn't. Because hidden inside it is one of the most remarkable immigration stories in modern Canadian history. Today, more than 300,000 Vietnamese Canadians live across the country. They run restaurants in Toronto, markets in Vancouver, professional offices in Montreal, farms across the Prairies, factories, distribution companies, shopping plazas, community organizations, and businesses generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Walk through Vancouver's Kingsway district and you'll find hundreds of Vietnamese-owned businesses stretching across entire commercial corridors. Sit inside Golden Turtle in Toronto and you'll be eating in one of the city's most iconic Vietnamese restaurants, serving customers since 1987. Attend Taste of Vietnam at Nathan Phillips Square, and you'll find thousands of people celebrating a culture that once barely existed in Canada at all.
We're also here to share the richness of the Vietnamese culture to the entire population.
Because 50 years ago, there were fewer than 2,000 Vietnamese people in the entire country. No Little Saigons, no Vietnamese festivals, no Vietnamese commercial districts, no Vietnamese Canada. Then the boats started arriving. One refugee family remembers pirates boarding their vessel in the South China Sea.
They took everything from us: gold, jewelry, and even our wedding ring.
Another refugee would later summarize the experience in a single sentence.
Nobody wanted us.
Welcome to Canada.
Canada chose us.
And Canada did. Between 1979 and 1980, tens of thousands of Vietnamese refugees arrived through one of the largest refugee resettlement efforts in Canadian history. Churches sponsored families, synagogues sponsored families, Mennonites sponsored families, teachers, retirees, factory workers, people who had never met a Vietnamese person before opened their homes to complete strangers. One teenager arrived in British Columbia with almost nothing. Today, the company he founded generates more than $200 million annually. A refugee child became a doctor in Winnipeg. The children of factory workers became engineers, entrepreneurs, artists, and public servants. What began as a humanitarian rescue mission became one of the most successful refugee stories in modern history. But it also created a deeper question. What happens after survival? What happens after the camps close? After the sponsors leave? After the children grow up? What happens when refugees stop being refugees? Tonight, we travel from the refugee boats of the South China Sea to the streets of Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, Winnipeg, and beyond, to explore how fewer than 2,000 people became more than 300,000. A story about sponsorship, sacrifice, identity, belonging, and the people Canada chose. This is the human map, because when people move, the map moves with them. Subscribe and explore the networks quietly reshaping the world. The pirates took the gold first, then the jewelry, then the wedding ring. Years later, Trinh Nguyen could still remember the details. Her family had already left Vietnam. They had already survived the decision that millions of people faced after the fall of Saigon. They had boarded a crowded boat, crossed dangerous waters, and escaped a country that no longer felt safe. Then, somewhere in the South China Sea, pirates boarded their vessel and stripped passengers of nearly everything they owned. The boat continued drifting. The refugees continued waiting. Nobody knew where they would end up. Nobody knew if any country would take them. They only knew they could not go back. In April 1975, Saigon fell. For some Vietnamese families, it marked the end of a war. For others, it marked the beginning of a journey. Over the next decade, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese would leave their homeland. Some escaped by airplane. Many escaped by boat. Small fishing vessels crossed open seas carrying entire families. Storms sank boats. Engines failed. Pirates attacked. Refugee camps filled across Southeast Asia. Those who survived became known around the world as the boat people. One refugee later summarized the experience with a sentence that still echoes through the Vietnamese Canadian community.
Nobody wanted us.
Welcome to Canada.
Canada chose us.
At the time, there was almost no Vietnamese Canada. Before 1975, fewer than 2,000 Vietnamese people lived in the entire country. There were no major Vietnamese commercial districts, no Little Saigons, no large cultural festivals, no sprawling networks of restaurants, markets, and family businesses. Everything that exists today had yet to be built. Then, Canada made a decision that would change the country's demographic map. Between 1979 and 1980, Canada launched one of the largest refugee resettlement efforts in its history. Eventually, roughly 60,000 Vietnamese refugees would arrive. But what happened next is why this story is remembered. Governments opened the door. Ordinary Canadians walked people through it. Church congregations sponsored families. Synagogues sponsored families. Mennonite communities sponsored families. Teachers, retirees, factory workers, and neighbors signed legal agreements promising to support complete strangers they had never met. Many sponsors had never spoken to a Vietnamese person in their lives. Yet they prepared spare bedrooms, gathered winter coats, furnished apartments, helped newcomers register for school, taught them how to ride buses, navigate Canadian bureaucracy, and survive winters colder than anything they had ever experienced. One young refugee spent time in a camp in Hong Kong before arriving in Canada through sponsorship. Years later, looking back, he realized his entire future had depended on strangers deciding that his family deserved a chance. The system became so successful that Canada's private sponsorship model would later become a global reference point for refugee resettlement. But sponsorship solved only the first problem. The refugees had arrived. Now, they had to build lives. And building required sacrifice. One Vietnamese Canadian remembers watching his parents operate almost like a relay team.
They hardly got to see each other because they had 5 kids.
Right.
And my dad would work during the day, and then my mom would go in during the night, and vice versa on their shifts.
The arrangement allowed someone to stay home with the children. It also meant the parents rarely saw each other. Across Canada, thousands of Vietnamese families lived similar lives. Factory shifts, night shifts, farm work on weekends, long commutes, small apartments, relentless savings. The first generation often measured success in simple terms: a stable home, children who could attend university, a future safer than the one they had left behind. And slowly, those sacrifices began producing something larger than anyone expected. The refugees spread across the country. Vancouver emerged as one of the largest centers. Toronto grew rapidly. Montreal developed a distinct French-speaking Vietnamese community. Smaller but influential populations appeared in Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Ottawa, Victoria, and dozens of other cities. At first, these were simply places where refugees lived. Then they became places where refugees built. Restaurants opened, markets opened, community associations formed, relatives sponsored relatives, networks expanded. Children became doctors, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, artists, and public servants. A humanitarian operation was quietly becoming a permanent part of Canada's social and economic landscape. But before there were festivals, shopping plazas, and successful businesses, there was a road in Vancouver where newcomers searched for something much smaller. A familiar language, a familiar smell, a bowl of pho, and proof that home had survived the journey across the Pacific. The smell arrives before the signs. Star anise, cinnamon, slow-cooked broth simmering for hours before sunrise, fresh banh mi cooling behind bakery counters, Vietnamese coffee dripping through metal filters into condensed milk. On Kingsway in East Vancouver, entire blocks feel like they were assembled from memory. Restaurants, markets, jewelry stores, travel agencies, pharmacies, bakeries, insurance offices, law firms. Signs in Vietnamese sit beside signs in English. Elderly shoppers push carts filled with herbs and vegetables, while younger professionals stop for lunch between meetings. The neighborhood feels permanent. But permanence is often the last thing immigrant communities achieve. 40 years ago, almost none of this existed. When Vietnamese refugees began arriving in British Columbia during the late 1970s and early 1980s, Vancouver offered safety. It did not offer familiarity. The first generation worked wherever work could be found. Factories, warehouses, restaurants, construction sites, farms. Many had professional skills that Canada did not recognize. Others had interrupted educations. Almost all were starting over. One Vietnamese Canadian remembers exactly what that looked like inside his own household.
My dad would work during the day, and then my mom would go in during the night, and vice versa.
The family had 5 children. One parent came home, the other left. Then they switched again. The goal was not prosperity. The goal was stability. And yet stability eventually produced something larger: ownership. Along Kingsway, storefronts began appearing, then more storefronts, then entire plazas. Today, more than 430 businesses operate throughout Vancouver's Little Saigon district, making it one of the most significant Vietnamese commercial corridors in Canada. What visitors see as restaurants and markets are actually the visible surface of decades of family sacrifice. One of the most remarkable stories belongs to Dan On. In 1979, he arrived in Canada as an 18-year-old refugee. At Vancouver International Airport, he was welcomed by George and Irene Kavanagh, the Canadian couple sponsoring him. Like thousands of other sponsors across the country, they were taking a chance on someone they had never met. Years later, Dan remembered what happened next. The Kavanaghs helped him settle into life in British Columbia. George owned a cereal business. Dan began working there during the day while taking restaurant jobs at night. Looking back, he remembers sensing exactly what his sponsors hoped for. I was looking at their eyes and they were telling me, just go to work. So he did, for years. Then he borrowed money, started the small food processing company, expanded, expanded again, and expanded again. Today, Dan D Foods generates more than $200 million in annual revenue, employs hundreds of workers, exports products around the world, and helped earn Dan On an unusual nickname, Canada's Cashew King. His story is exceptional, but the pattern behind it is visible throughout Kingsway. A refugee family opens a restaurant. The children help after school. The restaurant succeeds. The children attend university. The family buys property. Another business opens. A grocery store, a bakery, a travel agency, a professional office. The network compounds itself. Walk through the district today and the businesses function as more than businesses. Markets become meeting places. Restaurants become community centers. Shop owners share job opportunities. Customers exchange housing information. New arrivals find their first connections. One business owner helps a cousin. The cousin helps a friend. The friend sponsors a relative. And gradually, an entire ecosystem emerges. The result is a neighborhood that feels deeply Vietnamese without ever stopping being Canadian. The evidence is everywhere, in the food, in the language, in the architecture of everyday life. Because immigrant communities rarely rebuild their homeland, instead, they build something new, something that carries pieces of the old world into the new one. And nowhere is that more visible than in the neighborhoods where people gather to eat. Thousands of kilometers east, another Vietnamese community was doing exactly that. But there was one major difference. The conversations happening around the tables were not taking place in English. They were taking place in French. And that would produce one of the most distinctive Vietnamese communities anywhere outside Vietnam. Walk into a Vietnamese restaurant in Montreal, and something feels different. The menu is familiar, the pho is familiar, the spring rolls are familiar. But the conversations happening around the room are often taking place in French, not English, French. And that small detail reveals one of the most unusual chapters in the Vietnamese Canadian story. Most people think of Vietnamese communities in North America through places like Orange County, San Jose, Houston, Vancouver, or Toronto. But Montreal developed something different. A Vietnamese community shaped not only by migration, but by language.
Welcome to Montreal. This vibrant destination is the biggest French-speaking city in North America.
The story begins long before the refugees arrived. For nearly a century, Vietnam was governed as part of French Indochina. French colonialism left deep wounds, but it also left behind a linguistic connection that would unexpectedly shape migration patterns decades later. When large numbers of Vietnamese refugees began arriving in Canada after 1975, Quebec suddenly offered something unique. Many newcomers already had some familiarity with French. Some had attended French language schools. Others had worked within French administrative systems. For families trying to rebuild their lives, Montreal felt less foreign than it might have appeared on a map. And over time, one of Canada's most distinctive Vietnamese communities emerged. Today, tens of thousands of Vietnamese Canadians live across Greater Montreal. Vietnamese restaurants, cafes, grocery stores, professional offices, and community organizations stretch across the metropolitan area, creating a community that feels simultaneously Vietnamese, Quebecois, and Canadian. The blending is visible everywhere. Vietnamese dishes beside French pastries, bilingual children translating for grandparents, families moving comfortably between two cultural worlds. And for many immigrants, finding that balance was not easy. Nguyen No remembers arriving in Canada and feeling pressure to fit in.
When I first moved to Canada, I really felt like I needed to blend in, and I thought that meant to be like less Vietnamese.
It is a feeling familiar to many children of immigrants. At school, they learn one set of expectations. At home, another. One language outside, another language at the dinner table. One culture in public, another in private. Many spend years trying to decide which version of themselves is supposed to be real. Nguyen eventually realized she had misunderstood what integration actually meant. As she grew older, she noticed something unexpected. People were interested, curious, open. People were genuinely curious about your culture. That realization changed everything. The goal no longer became choosing between identities. The goal became carrying both. Montreal was uniquely suited for that conversation. After all, Quebec itself understands cultural negotiation.
We're also here to share the Vietnamese, the richness of the Vietnamese culture to the entire population.
The province has spent generations balancing multiple identities, languages, and histories. For many Vietnamese newcomers, that environment created room for something new to emerge. Not a Vietnamese copy of Montreal, and not a Vietnamese community isolated from Quebec. Something hybrid, something distinctly Vietnamese Canadian. Community organizations expanded, language schools appeared, professional networks formed, cultural festivals grew larger each year. The first generation that arrived as refugees raised children who became teachers, engineers, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, academics, and public servants. The community was no longer simply adapting to Canada. It was helping shape Canada. And nowhere is that transformation more visible than in the second generation. Children who grew up speaking French at school, Vietnamese at home, and moving comfortably between both worlds. Children who inherited refugee stories but never experienced the refugee journey themselves. Children who understood that survival and belonging are not the same thing. The first generation had focused on survival. The second generation began asking a different question. What does it actually mean to be Vietnamese Canadian? That question was being asked in Montreal. It was being asked in Vancouver. It was being asked in Toronto. And nowhere would the answers become more visible than in Canada's largest city. Because in Toronto, Vietnamese Canada would stop being a hidden community. It would become an entire economic ecosystem. Restaurants, markets, shopping plazas, food festivals, family businesses, and some of the most recognizable Vietnamese institutions in the country. The story was no longer about arriving. The story was becoming about building. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the dining room at Golden Turtle is already filling up. Bowls of pho move from the kitchen. Steam rises toward the windows. Customers sit beneath photographs and decorations that have barely changed in decades. Outside, downtown Toronto rushes past. Inside, time moves differently. Golden Turtle opened in 1987. For many Vietnamese Torontonians, it is more than a restaurant. It is a landmark. One visitor described it simply.
Golden Turtle is one of the most iconic spots in Toronto. It's one of the oldest Vietnamese restaurants here, and it was first opened in 1987.
The restaurant survived because it serves food. It became iconic because it serves memory. And across Toronto, thousands of Vietnamese families built similar places. Not just restaurants, entire systems. By the 1980s and 1990s, Vietnamese communities were expanding rapidly throughout the Greater Toronto Area. New arrivals settled across neighborhoods stretching from downtown Toronto to Scarborough, North York, Mississauga, and beyond. Unlike some immigrant groups that concentrated in a single district, Vietnamese Toronto developed through networks of plazas, commercial corridors, markets, cafes, and family-owned businesses spread throughout the city. The result was not one Little Saigon, it was many. A citywide network connected by food, language, family, and community. One of the businesses helping define that landscape is An Dao. The restaurant opened in 1983. Its story mirrors the broader Vietnamese Canadian experience. They came over from Vietnam with pretty much nothing, one member of the family explains when discussing the first generation. Like many refugee families, they worked relentlessly. Long hours, thin margins, constant uncertainty. The goal was simple: create something stable enough for the next generation. And eventually, the next generation arrived. The children who had grown up helping in family businesses inherited a completely different challenge. Not survival, management, growth, modernization. One owner describes the reality bluntly.
But now I gotta do from A to Z.
The pressure intensified during COVID. Dining rooms closed. Customers disappeared. Businesses that had survived for decades suddenly faced a crisis unlike anything before. Many family restaurants survived only through extraordinary effort. Parents cooked, children handled deliveries, relatives helped with bookkeeping. Entire households became emergency management teams. Yet the businesses endured, and today they form part of an ecosystem that extends far beyond restaurants. Walk through Vietnamese commercial centers in the Greater Toronto Area, and the infrastructure becomes obvious. Kien Hum, First Way, Win Food Market, Quay Tan, grocery stores stocked with products imported from Southeast Asia, bakeries producing fresh banh mi, markets selling ingredients unavailable in mainstream supermarkets, pharmacies, travel agencies, professional services. Every immigrant community eventually creates institutions that make daily life easier. Vietnamese Canadians built theirs through thousands of small businesses. The food became one of the most visible expressions of that success. At Pho Dak Biet, one customer describes the feeling of entering the restaurant.
Once you step inside the restaurant, it feels like an escape from the noise outside.
That sentence explains something larger than a restaurant. For many immigrants, these places function as cultural refuges. A place where language requires no translation. A place where food carries memory. A place where people understand where you came from without explanation. Over time, Vietnamese culture became increasingly visible throughout Toronto itself.
Vietnamese Cultural Day took place at City Hall today. People coming together to share their traditions with everyone here.
Not hidden, not private, public. At Nathan Phillips Square, thousands gather for Taste of Vietnam. Lanterns, music, food stalls, traditional performances. Families introducing younger generations to traditions their grandparents carried across the Pacific decades earlier. The refugees who arrived with almost nothing had built something remarkable. Not just businesses, visibility, belonging, presence. And by the 21st century, Vietnamese Canada was no longer defined solely by the first generation. A new generation was emerging, one that spoke English or French fluently, one that moved comfortably between cultures, one that inherited refugee stories, but not refugee memories. The question facing them was no longer how to survive Canada. The question was how to define themselves inside it. And that question would lead many Vietnamese Canadians back towards something their parents once feared they might lose: their identity. For the first generation, Canada was survival. For the second generation, it became a question. What exactly are we now? Vietnamese? Canadian? Both? Neither? The children of refugees grew up in a world their parents could barely have imagined. Many spoke English or French more comfortably than Vietnamese. Many attended universities their parents never had the opportunity to attend. Many entered professions that seemed impossibly distant from the factory floors, farms, restaurants, and warehouses that had sustained the first generation. But success created its own complications. Yet No remembers believing that fitting in required becoming less Vietnamese. Years later, her perspective changed. Instead of hiding her culture, she began embracing it. And she discovered something unexpected. That realization reflects a broader shift taking place across Vietnamese Canada. For many children of refugees, identity stopped being a choice between two worlds. It became a bridge between them. The evidence is visible everywhere. Young Vietnamese Canadians run restaurants their parents founded. Others become doctors, lawyers, engineers, professors, artists, entrepreneurs, community leaders. The refugee generation focused on security. The next generation began exploring possibility. One of the most remarkable examples comes from Winnipeg. As a child, Dr. Chan Lee arrived in Canada as a refugee. His family had escaped Vietnam and started over in a country where they knew almost nobody. Years later, he became a physician. Looking back, he often reflects on the people who helped his family during those early years. He saw the possibility that I could be something for somebody else, and I want to be now the reason for somebody else's possibility. That sentence captures something deeper than personal success. It describes a cycle. One generation receives help. The next generation becomes the helper. One generation survives. The next generation builds. And nowhere is that transformation more visible than in the relationship many young Vietnamese Canadians now have with Vietnam itself. For their parents, Vietnam was often associated with trauma, war, escape, loss. For many younger Vietnamese Canadians, Vietnam represents something different: curiosity, connection, opportunity, a place to rediscover, a place to visit, sometimes even a place to live. In Toronto, one of the most striking examples of this shift is Gong Café. The cafe originated in Vietnam and eventually expanded internationally, including to Canada. For many younger Vietnamese Canadians, places like this represent a cultural confidence that did not exist during the refugee years. The goal is no longer simply preserving identity. It is reimagining it. Vietnamese culture is no longer something hidden inside homes and community centers. It is visible, public, confident. And yet, none of this would have been possible without the sacrifices of the first generation. The fathers working factory shifts, the mothers working nights, the families saving every dollar, the restaurant owners sleeping only a few hours before opening again, the refugees who arrived with almost nothing and spent decades building foundations they might never personally enjoy. Perhaps no story captures that transformation better than Dan On. In 1979, he arrived in Canada as an 18-year-old refugee. He worked during the day, worked at night, saved relentlessly, started a small company, expanded it, expanded it again. Today, Dan D Foods generates more than $200 million annually and employs hundreds of people around the world. The refugee became an employer. The newcomer became an institution. The sponsored teenager became one of Canada's most successful Vietnamese entrepreneurs. And yet, Dan On's story is not the story of Vietnamese Canada. It is one version of it, because there are hundreds of thousands of others. Some run restaurants, some teach in classrooms, some practice medicine, some work in government, some raise families in suburbs their parents could never have afforded. Some still speak Vietnamese every day. Some barely speak it at all. But together, they form one of the most successful refugee communities in modern Canadian history. A community that began with overcrowded boats drifting across the South China Sea and ended up helping reshape the social, economic, and cultural landscape of an entire country. Somewhere in Vietnam, half a century ago, a family stepped onto a boat. They did not know where they were going. They did not know if they would survive the journey. They did not know that one day their children would grow up speaking English in Toronto, French in Montreal, or raising families in Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Ottawa, and dozens of other Canadian cities. They only knew they had to leave. The remarkable part of the story is not that they survived. The remarkable part is what happened afterward. Strangers sponsored strangers. Families opened their homes to people they had never met. Refugees became workers. Workers became business owners. Business owners became employers. And the children of the boat people became doctors, teachers, engineers, artists, entrepreneurs, public servants, and community leaders. Today, more than 300,000 Vietnamese Canadians live across the country. They built restaurants and markets, festivals and community organizations, neighborhoods and businesses. But they also built something less visible: trust, belonging, a sense of home. The story of Vietnamese Canada is often told as a refugee story, and it is. But it is also a story about what happens after the rescue. What happens when people are given a chance? What happens when survival becomes stability? And what happens when stability becomes a future? Because the boats crossed an ocean, but the real journey began after they arrived.